The old St. Durham County Hospital was one of those places that shouldn't still be operating, but the system kept alive on artificial life support. Its structure was ancient, with damp walls, yellow tiles, and hallways that smelled of cheap disinfectant and sleepless nights. During the day, the building was simply outdated, but on the night shift, workers agreed that the hospital changed. Sounds became sharper, lights flickered as if something were breathing inside the electrical system, and whispers seemed to come from areas that had officially been shut down for decades. Claire, a newly hired substitute nurse, knew nothing about any of this. She'd been called urgently to cover a night shift and accepted without asking many questions. She needed the job. When she arrived, the evening staff was leaving in a hurry, and no one bothered to warn her about the hospital's reputation. Claire was rational, scientific, and preferred to laugh at superstition. She had no idea what she would encounter that night. As she reviewed her task assignments, the supervisor asked her to organize old records in a storage room on the third floor. A simple, boring job, perfect for someone new. Claire took the documents and began walking down the silent corridors. No patients talking, no nurses rushing around, no machines beeping. Only the echo of her own footsteps. The archive room was narrow and filled with boxes coated in decades of dust. Claire switched on the wall lamp and got to work. Among the files, she found a set of medical charts belonging to a department unfamiliar to her: Underground Psychiatric Unit. The pages were yellowed, written by hand in fading ink. The strangest detail was that all progress notes ended on the same date, October 14th, 1978. No final signature, no follow-up notes, nothing. The last chart was signed by a nurse named Emily Rogers, and at the bottom of the page was a smeared handwritten warning: "Do not go to the basement. It isn't empty." Claire frowned. She assumed it was a joke or some relic of old panic and superstition. But as she closed the box, she heard something that made her freeze. Footsteps in the hallway, approaching slowly. Heavy, perfectly rhythmic footsteps. She turned immediately, but the corridor was empty. The steps continued, now behind her, as if someone were circling the room. Claire felt her skin tighten. The temperature began to drop. Her breath became visible. The lights flickered as if the whole system were dying. Claire decided to finish quickly and leave. But when she gathered the files, the lamp went out completely, plunging her into dense darkness. She pulled a small flashlight from her pocket and stepped outside quietly. The corridor felt longer than before, the shadows stretching as if the building were breathing. Then she heard another metallic sound, the elevator descending on its own, though no one had called it. The doors opened in front of her with a sharp click. Claire hesitated, but stepped inside. She pressed the button for the first floor. Instead, the elevator began to descend and continued past the lowest level. The panel lit up with a floor that didn't exist. Basement. Claire felt her heart pounding. When the doors opened, she saw an ancient hallway, poorly lit, covered in dust, but with recent marks of rolling gurney wheels on the floor. The elevator closed behind her. Claire was trapped, with no means of communication. She proceeded cautiously. The corridor walls were stained, scarred, and covered with names and messages written in desperate, dried ink. All dates were from the same year, 1978. At the end of the corridor, she found a metal door with a fallen plate. Claire picked it up and read, "Rogers Psychiatric Unit." The door opened with a groan that sounded almost human. Inside was an abandoned psychiatric ward. Rows of rusted beds, tables with decaying instruments, boarded up windows. At the old nursing station, she saw something that turned her blood to ice. The motionless silhouette of a woman in an old-fashioned white uniform, head bowed, like a forgotten statue. Claire slowly raised her flashlight. The figure lifted its head, revealing a pale face with hollow, gray, lifeless eyes. On her chest hung an old professional badge, Emily Rogers, nursing supervisor. Claire tried to speak, but there wasn't enough air in her lungs. Then she heard another sound, something metallic dragging across the floor from the darkness, like a gurney being pushed by invisible hands. Lights began shutting off one by one, as if something was moving through the ward, draining power as it advanced. The nurse took one silent step toward Claire. Claire ran. The hallway seemed endless, but she finally reached the elevator. She pressed the button frantically, praying it would respond. The doors opened, and she threw herself inside. The elevator shot upward unnaturally fast. When it opened again, she was back on the main level. She sprinted to the reception desk, tears streaming down her face. She tried to explain what had happened, but the staff only looked at her with confusion. They told her the basement had been sealed more than 40 years earlier, that no one could enter, and that no elevator even accessed that floor. Claire submitted her resignation before dawn. Weeks later, while digitizing old files, a new sheet was found mixed among the archive papers. It was handwritten in fresh blue ink. It read, "Night shift, new nurse, went down to the basement." It was signed clearly and neatly. Emily Rogers, 1978. Since then, staff at St. Durham County Hospital avoid using the elevator after midnight. Some swear that on certain shifts, they can hear the sound of a gurney rolling down a hallway that officially doesn't exist. In an industrial city in the northern United States, there was a massive corporate building that operated day and night. It had 3 underground parking levels, cold, silent, lit by buzzing white lights that sounded like insects trapped in a tube. During the daytime, the place was chaotic, but at night, it became empty except for one man, Alex, the night security guard. Alex had worked there for years. He was serious, methodical, used to spending long hours without speaking to anyone. The night shift didn't bother him. He preferred solitude. But the building hid something that had been dormant beneath the concrete for decades. Level B3 had been officially closed off. Nobody had parked down there since the mid-90s, when a mysterious incident occurred involving an employee who, according to official records, had suffered a fatal accident. However, a few of the older workers whispered different versions, that the man hadn't died, but had disappeared without leaving a body, that management had sealed off the level because something down there didn't want to be found. But like many workplace legends, time eroded the details. Alex, a practical man, never believed any of it, until one winter night, when he arrived at work and found the building strangely quiet. His supervisor informed him he was completely alone in the entire complex. The last cleaning crew had already left. Alex didn't mind. He simply checked his flashlight, tested his radio, and began his usual rounds. The first 2 levels were like always, empty, spotless, echoing only his footsteps on the concrete. But when he descended to level B3 for his routine sweep, even though the level was sealed, something felt different. The air was stale, as though it hadn't circulated in years. A thin layer of dust coated the floor, showing clearly that nobody had been down there recently. Alex swept his flashlight across the space and walked slowly. The walls were stained with moisture, the smell unpleasant, and in some areas the ceiling lights flickered erratically. That was all normal for an unused basement, but one thing bothered him. Tonight, the access door was unlocked. He always secured it at the end of his shift, and nobody had authorization to open it. He considered noting the incident in the logbook, but chose to continue. Maybe someone had forgotten to lock it earlier. However, as he moved deeper into the abandoned level, he noticed something disturbing. Fresh tire tracks on the dusty floor. A car had driven through that same night. Alex followed the tracks with controlled steps, but the silence grew heavier. His radio crackled briefly with interference. He tried contacting the front desk, but there was no signal. He continued anyway, with the irritating sensation that someone was watching him. The tracks led to an isolated parking spot near a cluster of support pillars where the lights flickered weakly. But there was no car, only an empty space and a dark pool of liquid at the center, like oil or grease. Alex leaned closer, pointed his flashlight, and realized it wasn't oil at all. It was extremely dark water, forming a trail that continued toward an auxiliary corridor. Alex followed the trail, increasingly uneasy. Level B3 was vast, with pillars that cast long, oppressive shadows. After several steps, he heard something that froze him in place. The unmistakable sound of an engine starting. It wasn't his imagination. Someone had started a car somewhere on that level. The sound wasn't coming from the ventilation system or from above. It was down there with him. Alex moved cautiously, knowing that nobody was supposed to be on that floor. If someone had driven in, he was required to report it, but with his radio down, he was alone. When he reached the internal ramp, he saw something that made his breath grow heavy. The automatic headlights of a black car switched on by themselves in the distance, as if someone had just turned a key. But the cabin was emptied and a chill crawled up Alex's spine. He approached the car, though every nerve in his body screamed to run. When he reached it, he noticed something worse. The inside of the windshield was fogged up, as if someone had been breathing their only seconds 8G as he stared. He heard a sharp bang behind him. He turned and saw a maintenance door slam shut on its own, the noise echoing like a gunshot against concrete. Something was moving in that level. He knew that now, with absolute certainty. Alex tried to stay rational. Maybe a malfunction, a sensor glitch. But when he looked back at the windshield, he saw something that drained the blood from his face. For perfectly clear fingerprints pressed from the inside of the fogged glass, as if an unseen hand had just placed them there. His heart hammered in his chest. He stepped back, and the engine of the car shut off instantly. Silence fell, a silence so absolute it made him dizzy, until he heard something far worse. Footsteps, not his, another said, dragging softly across the concrete behind one of the pillars. Alex pointed his flashlight and caught a glimpse of something for a split second. An old pair of worn black work boots, motionless in the shadows. When he raised the beam to see who they belonged to, nothing was there. But he recognized something terrifying. Those boots matched the description for the old incident report. The missing employee from the 90s, a man no one had ever seen leave the basement. Alex began backing up, but when he turned, he noticed that the emergency exit door was now slightly open. And beside it, pinned to the internal maintenance board, was what looked like a document. There shouldn't have been anything there. Alex moved closer and read IT that IT was a log sheet dated 1994, handwritten, describing the night shift and listing a final item. Follow up on missing employee, located on level B3. Signed by the same supervisor from that era, a man who had died years later. Alex swallowed hard. His entire body trembled. He tried opening the door to leave, but something pushed it shut from the other side, slamming it so hard the concrete shook. He stepped back, panicking, and then heard something that would mark him for life. The sound of breathing right behind him, so close he could feel the air on the back of his neck that he ran without looking back. He reached the secondary emergency door, bolted up the stairs, and didn't stop until he reached the lobby. There, he finally managed to contact the supervisor by phone. When he explained what had happened, the supervisor asked for a formal report, but didn't sound surprised. He only said, "You're not the first to see that. That level should never have been sealed or left unmonitored." Alex quit that same week. The building continued operating, but level B3 was welded shut completely, as if it had never existed to this day. Some employees say that when they go down to level B2 at night, they can still hear, somewhere far below, the sound of a car engine starting by itself. Highway 47, in the remote northern plains of the United States, was known among truck drivers as the longest, darkest, most monotonous stretch of road in the region. A highway surrounded by endless miles of nothing, dry fields, twisted trees, abandoned utility poles that looked like silent sentinels watching every passing vehicle. Nobody liked driving through it at night. Some claimed they had seen lights moving through the brush with no cars nearby. Others swore shadows crossed the road only to vanish once they reached the other side. But the oldest story, the one told in a low voice with a distant stare, spoke of a whistle that could only be heard when a driver was completely alone. Ethan Walker had been a long-haul trucker for 15 years. He was used to crossing the country hauling heavy machinery, agricultural equipment, even live livestock. He never believed in ghosts or roadside legends, but on the night of August 17th, he began to reconsider. His run was simple: deliver 4 tons of industrial parts to an assembly plant in Montana. He was supposed to arrive in the morning, but a storm delayed his departure, forcing him to drive through the early hours, right when Highway 47 was at its quietest and most dangerous. The dashboard clock read 2:43 a.m. when he noticed something strange. The radio volume dropped on its own, as if the signal were fading, yet the frequency meter remained stable. The broadcast turned into a thin murmur, then died altogether. The engine kept rumbling, but everything else seemed dead. No wind, no insects. Nothing. The road felt narrower, like the trees had crept closer in the dark. His headlights reached only a few meters ahead, and the edge of the asphalt blurred into the blackness. The air inside the cab grew heavier. Ethan felt pressure in his chest, as if the atmosphere had thickened. Then he heard a whistle. The IT didn't come from the radio or the engine. It sounded as if somebody had leaned in through the open window and released a long, faint note, almost childlike, but filled with something ancient, primitive, inhuman. Ethan frowned, thinking he was just tired, but the sound returned, this time closer. The truck began to tremble lightly, even though the road was perfectly smooth. The sensation that something was running alongside the vehicle filled him with rising anxiety. Highway 47 was usually straight for long stretches, but suddenly the road began to curve. The white lane markings faded under a mist rising from the ground, as if the earth itself were exhaling. Ethan slowed down. His hands sweated on the wheel, his heartbeat accelerating. The truck's right headlight flickered, then died. The left one followed. For several seconds he was swallowed by total darkness. And then he saw that a figure walked along the shoulder of the road, barely visible inside the faint halo of the remaining light. It was tall, too tall to be human, with long, disproportionate limbs. Its body seemed made of bone and shadow. No clothes, no features, no visible skin, a ruined body dragged by the wind. But its movement was the worst part. It advanced without bending its legs, almost floating several inches above the ground. The whistle returned, louder, clearer, echoing inside the cab, as if coming from the passenger seat. The truck began to lose power. Ethan pressed the accelerator, but the engine choked, as if someone had blocked the airflow. The figure moved closer, swallowed by the fog. The last headlight flickered once and went out completely. Darkness devoured everything. The whistle didn't stop. The IT grew deeper, vibrating inside his skull. Ethan's hands trembled, but he kept the wheel steady. He felt that if he stopped, something would climb into the truck, something he should never see. The engine roared back to life. The truck lurched forward with sudden force, cutting through the darkness. The figure drifted backward into the fog, but the whistle continued. Now he heard it behind him in the trailer, like whatever it was had boarded the vehicle without leaving prints or opening a door. A cold pressure crept up his neck. A tingling spread down his legs. The sensation of being watched became unbearable. 3 miles later, the fog vanished. The headlights returned. The motor stabilized. The road looked normal again. Nothing seemed out of place. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it was still inside the truck, breathing quietly, waiting till he arrived at his destination at dawn, fingers numb from fear. He delivered the cargo like nothing had happened. But when he stepped out of the cab, he noticed something that froze him. On the passenger side window were long, thin marks like fingerprints, but too stretched and too sharp to belong to any person. After that night, other truckers began hearing rumors about a driverless truck traveling Highway 47 at low speed, a faint whistle filtering between the trees. Some claimed they'd seen a long, twisted figure sliding behind the empty cab, as though guarding whatever it had found. Ethan stopped driving at night. He never spoke about what he saw, but every time he heard a whistle in the distance, his skin crawled until it hurt. That on Highway 47, when the dawn is darkest, silence has an owner. And whatever whistles on the roadside is not looking for company. It only wants to remind the living that it's still there, walking among them, waiting for the next driver who becomes completely alone.